Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Knitting Needle Murder. Chapter 1. A peaceful evening disturbed. The village hall of St. Mary Mead wore its customary air of gentle shabbiness on that particular Thursday evening in late October. The autumn wind rattled the tall windows, sending the occasional shower of golden leaves dancing past the glass, while inside, the ladies of the St. Mary Mead knitting circle had arranged themselves in their familiar semicircle of wooden chairs. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the delicate lacework pattern she was creating for her nephew Raymond's new baby. The soft click of knitting needles provided a soothing rhythm to the evening's gentle chatter, punctuated by the occasional exclamation of delight over a particularly intricate stitch, or the mild frustration of a dropped loop. "I do think Mrs. Henderson's roses looked rather peaked this afternoon," remarked Mrs. Bantry, her needles working steadily through what appeared to be the beginning of a rather ambitious Fair Isle jumper. "Perhaps she's been a bit too generous with that new fertilizer Colonel Melcher recommended." The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looked up from her neat rolls of plain knitting, a sensible grey scarf that would no doubt find its way to the church's charity basket. "Oh, but her dahlias have never looked better," she said in her soft, measured voice. "I suppose one must take the rough with the smooth in gardening, mustn't one?" Miss Marple smiled gently. There was something rather comforting about these weekly gatherings. The same familiar faces, the same gentle gossip, the same comfortable routines that had sustained the village through war and peace alike. Even the addition of new members seemed to blend seamlessly into the established pattern. Mrs. Ashford, who had joined them only 6 weeks ago after moving into Lavender Cottage, was proving to be a most accomplished knitter. Her current project, an elaborate Aran cardigan with intricate cable work, displayed a skill that put many of the more established members to shame. She was a quiet woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and a rather nervous manner that suggested she had known trouble in her life. "That's a beautiful pattern you're working, Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple observed kindly. "It reminds me of one my dear mother used to knit. Irish fishermen's sweaters, weren't they? Though I believe the story was that each family had their own particular pattern, so that, well, in case of accidents at sea, you understand." Mrs. Ashford's hands stilled for a moment on her needles. "Yes," she said quietly. "My grandmother taught me. She said the cables were meant to represent ropes for safety, and the diamonds were for wealth and prosperity." She resumed her knitting with perhaps a touch more intensity than before. "How wonderfully symbolic," murmured Mrs. Clement. "I've always found it fascinating how our simple domestic crafts carry such deep meanings." Miss Weatherby snorted delicately from her corner chair. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman of indeterminate age who had never married and seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out the shortcomings of others. "Symbols are all very well," she said crisply, "but I prefer practical knitting. This," she held up her current project, "is a vest for my nephew in the Navy. Proper warm wool, sensible pattern, and it will last him years." "How thoughtful of you, Miss Weatherby," said Miss Marple, though she noticed that the woman's stitches were rather tight, which would make for an uncomfortable garment. "Still, The intention was kind, and Miss Marple had long ago learned that the intention often mattered more than the execution. The conversation drifted pleasantly from knitting to the upcoming harvest festival, from the new curate's rather unfortunate tendency to mumble during services, to the mystery of who had been leaving anonymous gifts of vegetables on doorsteps throughout the village. Miss Marple contributed her own observations with the gentle insight that had made her such a valued member of the community, though she kept her more acute deductions to herself. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Mrs. Bantry suddenly frowned and looked around the circle. "I say, where's Mrs. Pemberton got to? She's usually the first to arrive and the last to leave." Miss Marple glanced toward the far corner of the hall, where Mrs. Pemberton customarily sat. The chair was indeed empty, though she could see the woman's familiar tapestry knitting bag sitting beside it. "Perhaps she stepped out for a moment," suggested Mrs. Clement. "The ladies' room, you know." But Miss Weatherby was already rising from her chair with a slight frown creasing her sharp features. "She's been sitting over there the whole evening," she said, walking toward the corner. "I saw her when I came in at 7:30, and she seemed to be having some trouble with her knitting, rather agitated about something." Miss Marple set down her own work and followed, a peculiar unease beginning to flutter in her chest. Mrs. Violet Pemberton was not the sort of woman to simply disappear during a meeting. As the treasurer of that little circle, she took her responsibilities seriously and prided herself on her punctuality and attention to detail. The corner of the hall was partially hidden by an old oak screen that had been donated by the manor house years ago. As Miss Weatherby rounded the screen, her sharp intake of breath brought the other ladies hurrying forward. Mrs. Pemberton was indeed there, slumped forward in her chair, with her face buried in her knitting basket. At first glance, it might have appeared that she had simply dozed off, a not uncommon occurrence among the older members of the circle. But the unnatural angle of her body and the steel knitting needle protruding from the right side of her neck told a far more terrible story. Mrs. Ashford made a small choke sound and turned away. Mrs. Clement went very pale and reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. Mrs. Bantry, with characteristic forthrightness, stepped closer and then immediately stepped back again. "Oh, my dear," she said, in a voice that was not quite steady. "Oh, my dear, she's dead, isn't she?" Miss Marple moved forward with the calm efficiency that had served her well through decades of village crises both large and small. She did not touch the body, but her keen eyes took in every detail: the positioning of the arms, the way the knitting had fallen across Mrs. Pemberton's lap, the peculiar arrangement of wool skeins in the basket beneath her face. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm afraid she is. Miss Weatherby, would you be so kind as to telephone Constable Park? And Mrs. Clement, perhaps you might ask your husband to come over. I think we shall need all the help we can get." As the others hurried to carry out her quiet instructions, Miss Marple remained standing beside the body of Mrs. Pemberton, her sharp eyes noting details that she suspected would prove significant later. The knitting needle was not one she recognized. It was steel with an ornate silver top, quite distinctive and rather expensive looking. More interesting still was the fact that Mrs. Pemberton's own knitting needles, a modest bone set, were lying neatly in their case on the small table beside her chair. The wool in the basket beneath the victim's face was disarranged in a way that suggested a brief struggle, and there were several stitches pulled loose from Mrs. Pemberton's current project, a baby's blanket in soft yellow wool that she had been working on for her great niece. But most curious of all was the expression on Mrs. Pemberton's face, which Miss Marple could just glimpse despite the woman's position. There was something there beyond the surprise of sudden death, a look that might have been recognition, or perhaps even betrayal. Miss Marple stepped back from the scene, her mind already beginning to work through the implications of what she had observed. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that murder was rarely a random act of violence. There were always patterns, always connections, always reasons that made perfect sense once you understood the human hearts involved. And as she listened to the approaching footsteps of Constable Park and the vicar, she couldn't help but notice that all four of the remaining knitting circle members were looking considerably more distressed than the mere discovery of death would normally warrant. Someone in this room, she reflected sadly, was very good at keeping secrets. But then again, so was she. Chapter 2. Tangled Threads. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham brought with it the familiar atmosphere of official disapproval that Miss Marple had come to expect from her dealings with the local constabulary. Inspector Slack was a man of medium height and considerable self-importance, with a tendency to dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into his preconceived notions of proper police procedure. "Now then," he announced busily, surveying the scene with the air of a man who had seen it all before. "I'll need all your ladies to step well back from the deceased. This is a crime scene, and I won't have it contaminated by well-meaning interference." His eyes fell upon Miss Marple with particular disfavour. Their previous encounters had not endeared her to him, particularly since her observations had an uncomfortable tendency to prove more accurate than his own initial assessments. "Miss Marple," he said, with barely concealed irritation, "I suppose you've already formed your own theories about what happened here?" "Oh dear, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "I wouldn't presume to theorize so early, though I couldn't help but notice one or two small details that might be of interest." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that he found Miss Marple's small details about as welcome as a wash's nest in his garden shed. "I'll be the judge of what's interesting, thank you very much. Now, if you'll all kindly take seats over there," he gestured toward the far end of the hall. "I'll conduct my examination of the scene." As the ladies reluctantly moved away, Miss Marple caught the eye of Dr. Haydock, who had arrived with the inspector. The elderly doctor gave her an almost imperceptible nod. He, at least, had learned to value her insights over the years. From her enforced distance, Miss Marple watched as Inspector Slack began his investigation with characteristic thoroughness, if not imagination. He photographed the scene from various angles, made notes in his leather-bound notebook, and examined the murder weapon with the aid of a magnifying glass. "Interesting piece," she heard him mutter to Dr. Haydock. "Steel knitting needle, quite distinctive. See this silver top? Rather ornate work. Not the sort of thing you pick up at Woolworths." Dr. Haydock bent closer to examine the needle. "Definitely foreign manufacture, I'd say. The workmanship is too fine for English production. German, perhaps, or Swiss." Miss Marple's keen ears picked up every word, though she maintained the appearance of quiet attention to her own knitting. She had indeed noticed the quality of the needle, and something about it nagged at her memory, though she couldn't quite place what. Inspector Slack turned his attention to Mrs. Pemberton's knitting basket, carefully removing the skeins of wool that had been disturbed during the attack. "Yellow wool," he observed. "Baby's blanket by the look of it. Half finished." He held up the partially completed garment, noting the loose stitches where it had been pulled during the victim's final struggle. Mrs. Pemberton was known for her charitable knitting, offered Mrs. Clement from across the room. She was always making things for the church sales or for families in need. Was she indeed? Inspector Slack made another note. And what about her own knitting equipment? "These bone needles here. They seem quite different from the murder weapon." Mrs. Bantry cleared her throat delicately, Violet always used those old bone needles, said they were her mother's, and she wouldn't knit with anything else. Rather superstitious about it, actually. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. If Mrs. Pemberton was so particular about her own needles, then the ornate steel one had definitely come from someone else's collection. Inspector Slack began his questioning of the witnesses with his usual blend of officiousness and impatience. Each lady was asked to account for her movements during the evening, to describe her relationship with the deceased, and to explain her knowledge of the murder weapon. Mrs. Bantry, questioned first, explained that she had arrived at the hall at precisely 7:30, as was her custom. "I always come early to help set up the chairs," she said. Mrs. Pemberton was already there, sitting in her usual corner. She seemed, well, rather agitated about something. Not her usual self at all. "Agitated how?" Inspector Slack pressed. "Nervous, I suppose." She kept looking toward the door, as if she was expecting someone, and her knitting. Well, anyone could see she was making a hash of it. Violet was never one to make mistakes with her needlework. Mrs. Clement, when questioned, provided a similar account. She had arrived at 7:45, shortly after Mrs. Bantry. Mrs. Pemberton did seem distracted, she agreed. When I greeted her, she seemed quite startled, as if her mind was elsewhere entirely. Miss Weatherby's testimony was characteristically sharp and precise. Mrs. Pemberton was definitely not herself this evening, she stated firmly. "I've known her for 15 years, and I've never seen her so fidgety. She kept dropping stitches and having to unknit whole rows. Most unlike her." When Inspector Slack turned to Mrs. Ashford, the newest member of the circle, Miss Marple noticed a distinct increase in the woman's nervousness. Her hands trembled slightly as she answered the inspector's questions. "I arrived at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Ashford said quietly. Mrs. Pemberton was... She seemed upset about something. She barely acknowledged my greeting, which wasn't like her at all. She's usually so welcoming to newcomers." "And this knitting needle?" Inspector Slack held up the murder weapon, carefully wrapped in his handkerchief. "Do any of you recognize it?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Miss Marple watched each face carefully, noting the various expressions of surprise, concern, and something that might have been recognition. Finally, Mrs. Ashford spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. It looks rather like one of mine." The inspector's attention focused on her with laser-like intensity. "One of yours, you say? Are you certain?" Mrs. Ashford's face had gone very pale. I have a set rather like that. German-made with the silver tops. They were my grandmother's, but I'd have to check my knitting bag to be sure if one is missing." Inspector Slack immediately demanded to examine Mrs. Ashford's knitting equipment. With shaking hands, she opened her tapestry bag and withdrew a leather needle case. Inside were 11 needles of various sizes, all with the distinctive ornate silver tops, but the case was clearly designed to hold 12. "One is missing," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "The size 8 needle. I hadn't noticed." The inspector's satisfaction was evident. "And when did you last see this missing needle, Mrs. Ashford?" I'm not sure. I haven't used that particular size for several weeks. I've been working on cables, you see, and they require different sizes." Miss Marple frowned thoughtfully. Something about this discovery seemed almost too convenient, too obvious. In her experience, murderers rarely left such clear evidence pointing directly to themselves, unless they were very foolish indeed, or unless someone was being deliberately framed. Inspector Slack, however, seemed entirely satisfied with this development. need you to come down to the station tomorrow morning, Mrs. Ashford," he announced. "There'll be further questions to be answered." As the evening wore on and the inspector completed his preliminary investigation, Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement of evidence with growing unease. The positioning of Mrs. Pemberton's body, slumped forward into her knitting basket, suggested that she had been taken completely by surprise. But the angle of the wound and the force required to drive the needle so deeply into her neck indicated that the attacker had been standing directly behind her. More puzzling still was the condition of Mrs. Pemberton's final knitting project. Miss Marple had noticed that while several stitches had been pulled loose during the struggle, the overall pattern seemed somehow deliberate in its irregularities. There were mistakes in the work, obvious ones that a knitter of Mrs. Pemberton's skill would never normally make, but they appeared to follow a certain sequence. As Inspector Slack finally declared the scene secure and began to disperse the witnesses, Miss Marple approached him with her characteristic diffidence. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Pemberton seemed to be troubled about something this evening. Perhaps there might be some connection to the charity work she did for the Circle. She was our treasurer, you know." Inspector Slack looked at her with barely concealed exasperation. "Miss Marple, I'm quite capable of conducting a thorough investigation without amateur assistance. If financial irregularities are involved, I'll discover them in due course." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied meekly. "I'm sure you will. It's just that in my experience, when people are as agitated as Mrs. Pemberton appeared to be this evening, it's often because they're wrestling with their conscience about something." But Inspector Slack had already turned away, dismissing her observations with characteristic abruptness. As Miss Marple gathered her own knitting and prepared to leave the village hall, she reflected that the inspector's confidence in his case against Mrs. Ashford might be somewhat premature. The murder weapon might indeed belong to the newcomer, but that didn't necessarily make her the murderer. In Miss Marple's long experience of human nature, the most obvious suspect was often the least likely to be guilty, particularly when the evidence pointing to them was quite so conveniently arranged. As she walked home through the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself thinking about patterns, not just the ones created with wool and needles, but the more complex patterns of human behavior that so often revealed the truth beneath surface appearances. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay some social calls. After all, it was only neighborly to check on the other members of the knitting circle after such a distressing evening. And if she happened to learn something useful about Mrs. Pemberton's recent troubles, well, that would simply be an unexpected bonus. Chapter 3. Dropped Stitches. The morning after the murder dawned grey and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy blanket. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and after attending to her modest breakfast and morning correspondence, she found herself contemplating the best approach to her intended social course. The news of Mrs. Pemberton's death had spread through the village with the inevitable speed of such tragic events. By 9 o'clock, Miss Marple had already received 3 telephone calls from concerned neighbors, each eager to share what they had heard and to speculate about the implications of Mrs. Ashford's apparent involvement. It was while she was tending to her small garden, despite the persistent drizzle, that Mrs. Bantry appeared at her gate, looking considerably more shaken than she had the previous evening. "Jane," she called, hurrying up the path with her umbrella held at an awkward angle. "I simply had to come and talk to someone sensible. I barely slept a wink all night, thinking about poor Violet and that dreadful business with the knitting needle." Miss Marple invited her friend into the sitting room, where she prepared tea with the automatic efficiency of long practice. Mrs. Bantry settled herself in the chintz armchair by the window, still clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline. I keep thinking there must be some mistake, Mrs. Bantry continued, accepting her cup with trembling hands. Mrs. Ashford seems such a quiet, respectable sort of person, not at all the type to commit murder. In my experience, Miss Marple observed gently, murderers rarely look the part. But tell me, had you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Pemberton lately? Apart from her agitation last evening, I mean. Mrs. Bantry frowned thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, she had been rather odd these past few weeks. Secretive, you might say. And she seemed to be avoiding certain topics of conversation. What sort of topics? Well, money matters for one thing. You know how she usually took such pride in giving us detailed reports about the charity fund, the amounts we'd raised, where the money was going, that sort of thing. But lately, whenever anyone asked about the fund, she changed the subject rather abruptly. Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. How interesting. And the funds have been doing well, I assume. That's just it. I'm not entirely sure. Viola used to tell us we'd raised nearly £40 for the War Orphans Christmas Fund. But when I mentioned it to the vicar last week, he seemed surprised. Said he thought the amount was rather less than that. This was indeed significant information. Miss Marple filed it away carefully, while maintaining an expression of mild interest. Perhaps there was simply some confusion about the accounting. Perhaps, Mrs. Bantry agreed, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. But there was something else too. I lent £5 to the fund myself last month. My housekeeping money was running short, you understand, and I thought I could spare it from my dress allowance. But when I asked Violet for it back, she seemed quite flustered. Said the money was all tied up in the bank and couldn't be withdrawn just then. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. The picture that was emerging was not a pleasant one, but it was becoming increasingly clear. Had anyone else lent money to the fund? I believe so. Miss Weatherby mentioned something about advancing money for all purchases, and I think Mrs. Clement may have contributed some of the church's petty cash on a temporary basis. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, still wringing her hands with worry, Miss Marple put on her mackintosh and set out for her first official social call. The vicarage seemed the most logical starting point, given Mrs. Clement's position as the vicar's wife and her potential connection to the missing church funds. She found Mrs. Clement in the morning room, attempting to work on some embroidery, but clearly finding it difficult to concentrate. The vicar's wife was a small, neat woman, with prematurely grey hair and a generally anxious disposition that seemed to have intensified considerably since the previous evening. Miss Marple, she said, rising hastily from her chair. How kind of you to call. I was just thinking how dreadful this all is, and wondering what we should do about the knitting circle. I mean, under the circumstances. I'm sure we'll find a way to continue, Miss Marple assured her. These activities mean so much to the community. Though I suppose there will be financial matters to sort out, with Mrs. Pemberton having been our treasurer. Mrs. Clement's face went very pale. Oh yes, the accounts. I suppose someone will have to. That is, the police will want to examine. She trailed off, wringing her hands in much the same manner as Mrs. Bantry. Is there some problem with the accounts? Miss Marple asked gently. Well, it's just that. Oh dear. I probably shouldn't say anything, but I've been rather worried about the charity fund. You see, my husband gave me £10 from the church collection to contribute to the War Orphans Fund, and when I asked Mrs. Pemberton for a receipt, she seemed quite put out. Said she'd send it along later, but she never did. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. How frustrating for you, and I suppose your husband will need proper documentation for the church records. Exactly. And now, with this terrible business. Oh, I do hope there isn't going to be some dreadful scandal about missing money on top of everything else. Miss Marple's next call was to Lavender Cottage, where she hoped to find Mrs. Ashford at home, despite the morning's interrogation at the police station. To her surprise, she found the woman in her small front garden, mechanically deadheading roses despite the continuing drizzle. Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple called softly, not wanting to startle her. I hope you don't mind my calling. I wanted to see how you were bearing up after last night's ordeal. Mrs. Ashford looked up with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she had spent the night weeping rather than sleeping. Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you. Please when you come in. I was just trying to keep busy, but I can't seem to concentrate on anything. The interior of Lavender Cottage was modest, but tastefully furnished, with the sort of carefully chosen pieces that suggested someone making the best of reduced circumstances. Mrs. Ashford led her into a small sitting room, where a half-finished piece of knitting lay abandoned on a side table. The police have been very thorough, Mrs. Ashford said, her voice barely above a whisper. They've searched the cottage, examined all my knitting supplies, asked me the same questions over and over again. I keep telling them I have no idea how my knitting needle came to be used in such a horrible way. You mentioned that you hadn't noticed it was missing, Miss Marple said carefully. When did you last use that particular needle? Mrs. Ashford pressed her hands to her temples. I've been trying to remember. It must have been at least 3 weeks ago. I was working on a jumper for someone, and I needed a size 8 for the ribbing. But I finished that project and put the needles away in their case. I'm always very careful about that. The case was in your knitting bag? Yes, always. I take it with me to the meetings, of course, but I also knit at home in the evenings. The case might have been left out on the table here, or upstairs in my bedroom. I live alone, so I'm not always as tidy as I should be. Miss Marple glanced around the spotless cottage and reflected that Mrs. Ashford's standards of tidiness were considerably higher than those of most people she knew. You've been in the village for only 6 weeks, I believe. Yes. I needed a fresh start. My husband died last year, and I found it difficult to remain in our old home. Too many memories, you understand. There was something in Mrs. Ashford's tone that suggested the memories were not entirely pleasant ones, but Miss Marple was too tactful to press the point directly. Instead, she said, It must be difficult, starting over in a new place. Had you met Mrs. Pemberton before joining the knitting circle? Only briefly, when I first moved in. She was very welcoming, brought me a jar of her homemade jam, and invited me to join the circle. I was grateful for the kindness. I'd been rather lonely, and it seemed like a pleasant way to meet people. And you got along well with her? Mrs. Ashford hesitated. Well, yes, mostly. Though, ... She trailed off, looking troubled. Though what, my dear? It's probably nothing, but last week she made some rather odd comments, asking me about my previous address, whether I'd left any debts behind, that sort of thing. It seemed quite intrusive, but I thought perhaps she was just being cautious about new members of the circle. Miss Marple's final call of the morning was to Miss Weatherby's neat, terraced house on the other side of the village green. She found the sharp, tongue spinster in her front parlour, engaged in what appeared to be an accounting exercise with a collection of receipts and a ledger book spread across her dining table. Miss Marple, she said questionably, looking up from her calculations. I suppose you've come to discuss this dreadful business about Mrs. Pemberton. Most shocking, I must say, though I can't pretend to be entirely surprised. Not surprised? Why is that? Miss Weatherby gestured toward the papers on her table. "I've been going through my own records, trying to make sense of some financial discrepancies. I'm afraid our dear treasurer may not have been quite as trustworthy as we all believed." She selected a receipt from the pile and held it up for Miss Marple's inspection. "I gave Mrs. Pemberton £15 3 weeks ago. Advance payment for wool that she was going to purchase in bulk for the Circle's Christmas charity projects. She gave me this receipt, but when I asked her last week about when the wool would be delivered, she became quite evasive." Miss Marple examined the receipt. It was written in Mrs. Pemberton's neat handwriting and properly signed, but there was something about the paper that caught her attention. "This looks like it might have been torn from a larger sheet," she observed. "Exactly what I thought, and when I pressed her about it, she claimed she'd lost her proper receipt book and was using whatever paper came to hand. Most unprofessional, I thought. And the wool never arrived. Never. I was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Pemberton was using our money for her own purposes. In fact, I was planning to raise the matter at last night's meeting." Miss Weatherby's expression grew grim. "I suppose someone else had discovered her little embezzlement scheme and decided to take more direct action." As Miss Marple walked home through the village, her mind was busy processing all the information she had gathered. The picture of Mrs. Pemberton that was emerging was far from the respectable, conscientious woman the knitting circle had believed her to be. It appeared that she had been systematically embezzling money from the charity fund, taking loans that she had no intention of repaying, and possibly even selling wool that was never delivered. But while this certainly provided several people with motives for murder, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the obvious nature of the evidence against Mrs. Ashford. The missing knitting needle, the woman's inability to account for its whereabouts, her status as a newcomer with a mysterious past. It all seemed rather too convenient. Moreover, there was something about Mrs. Ashford's manner that suggested she was hiding something, but not necessarily murder. In Miss Marple's experience, people often carried secrets that had nothing to do with the crime at hand, but which made them appear guilty nonetheless. As she reached her own garden gate, Miss Marple reflected that the investigation was becoming rather like a complicated knitting pattern. The more she examined the individual stitches, the more complex the overall design appeared to be. And somewhere in that pattern, she was certain, lay the key to understanding who had really driven that ornate German knitting needle into Mrs. Pemberton's neck. The question was whether she could unravel the truth before Inspector Slack's limited patience ran out, and he arrested Mrs. Ashford for a crime she might very well not have committed. Chapter 4. Patterns of Deception. The afternoon brought with it a temporary break in the weather, and Miss Marple decided to take advantage of the pale sunshine to visit the post office, which served as the unofficial information exchange for St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Emmett, the postmistress, was a shrewd woman who took a professional interest in the comings and goings of the village residents. "Terrible business about Mrs. Pemberton," Mrs. Emmett observed as Miss Marple purchased stamps for her weekly letters. "Though I must say, I had been wondering about some of the mail she'd been receiving lately." Miss Marple's ears perked up with interest. "Oh, well, you know how it is. One can't help but notice when someone starts getting letters from solicitors and banks." Mrs. Pemberton had been receiving quite a few official-looking envelopes these past weeks, and there was that registered letter last Tuesday that she seemed quite upset about. A registered letter. From London, it was. She had to sign for it, and I couldn't help but notice her hands were shaking something dreadful. She went quite pale when she saw the return address, though I couldn't make out what it was from where I was standing. This was indeed interesting information. Miss Marple made her way home with much to ponder, but her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her nephew Raymond, who had driven down from London unexpectedly. "Aunt Jane," he said, embracing her warmly. "I heard about the murder in the village, and thought I should come down to make sure you're all right. The newspapers are calling it the Knitting Circle murder. Rather sensational, don't you think? The press do love their dramatic headlines." Miss Marple agreed. "But I'm perfectly safe, dear. Though I must admit, I'm rather concerned about the direction the police investigation is taking." Over tea, she filled Raymond in on the details of the case, including her growing suspicions about the evidence against Mrs. Ashford. Raymond, who worked as a solicitor in London, listened with the professional attention he had learned to pay to his aunt's observations. "You think she's being framed?" he asked when she had finished. "I think someone is taking advantage of her vulnerable position as a newcomer to the village. She's the perfect scapegoat. No established relationships to vouch for her character. A mysterious past that makes people suspicious, and physical evidence that points directly to her. But surely the police will investigate her background thoroughly before making an arrest." Miss Marple's expression was doubtful. "Inspector Slack is not known for his thoroughness when he believes he has an obvious suspect, and Mrs. Ashford's reluctance to discuss her past will only reinforce his suspicions." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Ashford appeared at her door just as the sun was setting, looking even more distressed than she had that morning. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," she said, her voice barely steady. "But I didn't know where else to turn. The police. Inspector Slack has asked me not to leave the village, and I have the distinct impression that he intends to arrest me very soon." Miss Marple invited her in and settled her in the sitting room with a cup of tea and a small measure of brandy, which seemed to restore some color to the woman's pale cheeks. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it might be helpful if you told me something about your previous circumstances. I don't wish to pry, but if someone is trying to make you appear guilty of this crime, we need to understand why you might have seemed like a suitable target." Mrs. Ashford was quiet for a long moment, staring into her teacup as if it might provide answers to her troubles. Finally, she looked up with eyes that held a mixture of shame and resignation. "My name isn't really Ashford," she said quietly. "It's Thornton, Margaret Thornton. I changed it when I came here because I was afraid my husband might try to find me." "Your husband is still alive?" "Yes, unfortunately. When I said he had died, I was referring to the man I thought I had married. Kind, gentle, caring. The real Arthur Thornton was none of those things." Her hands tightened around the teacup. "He was violent, Miss Marple. Terribly violent. For 15 years, I lived in fear of saying the wrong thing, of making any mistake that might set him off." Miss Marple's heart went out to the woman. She had seen the effects of such marriages before, and she knew how difficult it was for women in Mrs. Ashford's position to find help or escape. "What finally made you leave?" "He nearly killed me," Mrs. Ashford said simply. "Last November, he flew into a rage over something trivial. I had forgotten to post a letter for him, and he struck me so hard that I was unconscious for nearly an hour. When I came to, I realized that if I stayed, the next time might truly be the last." "So you left while he was away?" "He traveled frequently on business. I waited until he was going to be gone for a week, packed only what I could carry in 2 suitcases and disappeared. I had been saving money secretly for years, hiding small amounts whenever I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rent this cottage and live quietly for a few months while I decided what to do next." "And Mrs. Pemberton somehow discovered your real identity?" Mrs. Ashford nodded miserably. "I think so. Last week she made some comments that suggested she knew I wasn't who I claimed to be. She asked about my late husband's business, whether there had been any insurance money, that sort of thing. I tried to change the subject, but she was quite persistent. Did she actually threaten you? Not in so many words, but there was something in her manner. I got the impression that she might want something from me in exchange for keeping my secret. I was terrified that she might contact Arthur somehow, let him know where I was. Miss Marple reflected on this information. It certainly provided Mrs. Ashford with a strong motive for murder. If Mrs. Pemberton had been planning to blackmail her, or reveal her location to her abusive husband, she might well have felt that murder was her only option for self-preservation. But something about the story didn't quite fit with Miss Marple's impression of the crime. The murder had been committed during the knitting circle meeting, in front of several witnesses, using a weapon that could be traced directly back to Mrs. Ashford. It seemed an extraordinarily risky and clumsy way to eliminate a blackmailer. "Mrs. Thornton," she said gently, "I understand why you felt you had to hide your identity, and I don't blame you for it in the least. But I need to ask you directly, did you kill Mrs. Pemberton?" Mrs. Ashford looked her straight in the eye. "No, Miss Marple, I did not. Whatever she might have threatened to do, I would never have hurt her. I've seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, and I could never inflict it on another person." Miss Marple believed her. There was something in the woman's manner, a bone-deep weariness and horror of violence, that convinced her that Mrs. Ashford was telling the truth. The next morning brought news that confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears. Inspector Slack had arrested Mrs. Ashford and charged her with the murder of Mrs. Pemberton. The evidence, he announced to the local newspaper reporter, was overwhelming. Miss Marple was contemplating this development over her morning tea when she received another unexpected visitor. Miss Weatherby appeared at her door, looking unusually agitated. "Miss Marple," she said without preamble, "I'd been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and there's something else I should tell you. Something about Mrs. Pemberton's behavior that struck me as odd." "Please do come in," Miss Marple said, leading her to the sitting room. "What sort of odd behavior?" "Well, you know how she always prided herself on her knitting skills, never made mistakes, always produced perfect work. But at our last few meetings, I noticed that her knitting seemed rather deliberate in its imperfections." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Deliberate how?" "Dropped stitches, twisted loops, that sort of thing. But they weren't random mistakes. They seemed to follow a pattern. I mentioned it to her once, thinking she might not have noticed, but she became quite defensive. Said her eyesight wasn't what it used to be." "But you didn't believe that?" "Mrs. Pemberton's eyesight was perfectly fine. She could thread a needle in dim light better than most people half her age. No, those mistakes were intentional. I'm certain of it." After Miss Weatherby had left, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, thinking about patterns within patterns. Mrs. Pemberton had been receiving mysterious letters, embezzling money from the charity fund, possibly blackmailing Mrs. Ashford, and deliberately making mistakes in her knitting that seemed to follow some sort of code. It occurred to her that she needed to examine Mrs. Pemberton's final knitting project more closely. If the woman had indeed been trying to communicate something through her needlework, it might provide a crucial clue to understanding who had killed her and why. The question was, how to gain access to evidence that was now in police custody. Inspector Slack was hardly likely to welcome her assistance, particularly now that he believed he had solved the case by arresting Mrs. Ashford. But Miss Marple had dealt with stubborn police inspectors before, and she had learned that there were often indirect ways of obtaining the information one needed. The key was to approach the problem from an unexpected angle, much like the solution to a complicated knitting pattern that seemed impossible until you found the right way to hold the needles. As she sat among her roses in the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple began to formulate a plan. Mrs. Pemberton's secrets were beginning to unravel, but there were still several threads to follow before the complete pattern would emerge, and she was becoming increasingly certain that when it did, it would reveal a very different murderer than the one currently sitting in the Marchbanham police station. Chapter 5. Knots and Alibis. The news of Mrs. Ashford's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency of village gossip, and by mid-morning, Miss Marple had received no fewer than 5 telephone calls from concerned neighbors, each eager to share their opinions on the matter. The general consensus seemed to be that while Mrs. Ashford had always seemed a quiet, respectable sort, one could never really know about newcomers, could one? Miss Marple found this rush to judgment both predictable and irritating. In her long experience, villagers were quick to close ranks against outsiders when trouble arose, regardless of the actual facts of the case. It was a human tendency she had observed many times before, and it rarely led to justice being served. She was contemplating how best to approach Inspector Slack about examining Mrs. Pemberton's knitting when salvation arrived in the form of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at her door looking unusually grave. "Jane," he said without preamble, "I've just come from the police station, and I'm not at all happy with the way this case is proceeding." Slack seems determined to railroad that poor woman without considering alternative possibilities. "I quite agree," Miss Marple replied, inviting him into her sitting room. "Have you had a chance to examine Mrs. Pemberton's body thoroughly?" "That's partly what concerns me. The angle of the wound suggests the killer was standing directly behind her, but Mrs. Ashford was sitting across the circle the entire evening. Several witnesses can attest to that." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Then how does Inspector Slack explain the physical evidence?" "He claims she must have moved around during the evening when no one was paying attention. But I've been thinking about the timing of the attack, and something doesn't add up." Dr. Haydock settled himself in his usual chair by the window. "I examined the body carefully, and based on the condition of the blood and the onset of rigor mortis, I'd estimate that Mrs. Pemberton died between 8:15 and 8:30, but according to all the witnesses, everyone was accounted for during that time period." "Everyone?" "Well, that's where it gets interesting. Mrs. Bantry went to the ladies' room at about 8:20, and Mrs. Clement stepped outside briefly around the same time, said she needed some fresh air. Miss Weatherby was working on her knitting, and claims she didn't look up from her needles for nearly 20 minutes. Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. "And Mrs. Ashford?" "She was working on that complicated cable pattern of hers. Several people noticed because she was having trouble with a particularly difficult section, and had to unknit several rows. She was definitely in her seat and visible to the others throughout the crucial time period." This was exactly what Miss Marple had suspected. The physical evidence and the timeline simply didn't support the case against Mrs. Ashford, but Inspector Slack was too committed to his theory to consider the contradictions. "Doctor," she said thoughtfully, "I don't suppose you've had a chance to examine Mrs. Pemberton's final knitting project. I am particularly interested in those deliberate mistakes that Miss Weatherby mentioned." Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose. "As a matter of fact, I did notice something odd about that baby blanket. The pattern seemed to contain irregularities that didn't look like normal mistakes to me. Rather reminded me of some of the coded messages we used during the war. Could you possibly arrange for me to examine it? I have some experience with knitting patterns, and I might be able to make sense of what Mrs. Pemberton was trying to communicate." Dr. Haydock considered this request. "I think I might be able to manage that. I need to return to the station this afternoon to complete my report, and I could probably convince Slack to let you have a look at the evidence. After all, you're just a harmless old lady with an interest in knitting. Miss Marple smiled at the description. She had found that being underestimated was often her greatest advantage in these situations. That afternoon, she found herself in the evidence room at the Much Benham police station, carefully examining Mrs. Pemberton's unfinished baby blanket under Dr. Haydock's supervision. Inspector Slack had grudgingly agreed to allow her access, mainly because Dr. Haydock had convinced him that understanding the victim's state of mind might help strengthen the case against Mrs. Ashford. The blanket was worked in a simple stitch pattern that should have produced regular, even rolls. But as Miss Marple studied it more closely, she could see that certain stitches had been deliberately altered. Some dropped, others twisted, some worked in the wrong direction entirely. "May I borrow a pencil and paper?" she asked Dr. Haydock. When he provided them, she began making notes, recording each irregularity and its position within the pattern. After 20 minutes of careful examination, a message began to emerge. The dropped stitches, when read in sequence, spelled out letters HELPME. Then, in the final rows that Mrs. Pemberton had completed before her death, BLACKMAIL. "Good heavens," Dr. Haydock murmured, looking over her shoulder at the decoded message. She was definitely trying to tell someone something. Miss Marple continued her examination of the blanket, looking for any additional clues. In the very last row, worked in stitches so tiny and irregular that they were almost invisible, she found one final word. CLEMENT. The vicar's wife, she breathed. Mrs. Pemberton was being blackmailed by Mrs. Clement. Dr. Haydock stared at the evidence in amazement. "But that's impossible. Mrs. Clement is one of the most respectable women in the village. She's been married to the vicar for nearly 10 years. "Has she indeed?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I think we need to have a much closer look at Mrs. Clement's background, don't you?" They left the police station with Inspector Slack none the wiser about their discovery. Miss Marple had carefully avoided mentioning the coded message, simply thanking him for allowing her to examine the poor dear's final work, and expressing her sadness at the incomplete baby blanket. That evening, Miss Marple telephoned her nephew Raymond in London. "Dear boy," she said, "I wonder if you may do me a small favor. I need you to look into the background of someone named Clement, specifically a woman who married the Reverend Leonard Clement approximately 10 years ago. What sort of information are you looking for? Marriage records, previous addresses, that sort of thing. I'm particularly interested in whether there might have been any irregularities in her past." Raymond promised to make inquiries through his professional contacts, and Miss Marple settled down to wait for the results. But she didn't have to wait long. The next morning brought a telephone call that confirmed her suspicions in the most dramatic way possible. Raymond's voice was tight with concern as he delivered his findings. "Aunt Jane, I think you may have stumbled onto something quite serious. I found records of a woman named Ellen Parsons who married a man named James Clement in Dover in 1938. But here's the interesting part. She was already married. Her first husband was a soldier named William Parsons, who was reported missing in action in 1936. But he wasn't actually killed. He turned up in a military hospital in 1939, suffering from shell shock and memory loss." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So, when she married the vicar, she was committing bigamy. Her first husband was still very much alive, though presumably she believed him dead when she remarried. The question is, did she ever discover the truth? "I rather think she did," Miss Marple said grimly, "and I suspect Mrs. Pemberton found out about it somehow. That registered letter from London that she received. It might have been from a solicitor or investigator acting on behalf of the first husband. If that's true, then Mrs. Clement had an enormous motive for murder. Exposure of her bigamy would ruin her husband's career and destroy their entire life in St. Mary Mead. After ending the call, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, thinking through the implications of what they had discovered. Mrs. Clement had motive, opportunity, and, most importantly, access to Mrs. Ashford's knitting needles. As one of the regular members of the knitting circle, she would have known about the distinctive German needles and could easily have borrowed one during a previous meeting. But proving Mrs. Clement's guilt would require more than circumstantial evidence and decoded knitting patterns. Miss Marple needed to find a way to make the vicar's wife reveal the truth, and she thought she knew exactly how to do it. The solution, like so many in her experience, lay in understanding human nature. Mrs. Clement had committed murder to protect her secret, but that very secret was also her greatest vulnerability. All Miss Marple needed to do was convince her that the truth was already known, and guilt and fear would do the rest. But first, she needed to get Mrs. Ashford released from custody. The poor woman had suffered enough, and Miss Marple was determined that justice would be served, not just for Mrs. Pemberton, but for all the innocent people whose lives had been damaged by one woman's desperate attempts to hide her past. As she sat among her roses in the fading light, Miss Marple began to plan her final confrontation with Mrs. Clement. Like working out a complicated knitting pattern, it would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. But she was confident that when all the threads were finally woven together, the truth would emerge as clearly as the words Mrs. Pemberton had encoded in her final, desperate message. Chapter 6. Unraveling the Truth. The morning following her conversation with Raymond brought Miss Marple a sense of grim determination. She had spent the night considering various approaches to confronting Mrs. Clement, and had finally settled on a strategy that would require considerable delicacy, but offered the best hope of success. Her first step was to pay a visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the future of the knitting circle in light of recent tragic events. She found Mrs. Clement in the kitchen, mechanically peeling potatoes for the evening meal, her movements sharp and nervous. "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself at the scrubbed pine table. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced. I've been so concerned about how this dreadful business has affected everyone." The vicar's wife looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past few days. "Of course not, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I haven't been very good company lately. This whole situation with Mrs. Ashford. It's all so terribly upsetting. Yes, it must be particularly difficult for you, having known Mrs. Pemberton for so long." Miss Marple paused deliberately. "Though I suppose we never really know people as well as we think we do we?" Mrs. Clement's hands stilled on the potato peeler. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just that Mrs. Pemberton seems to have had quite a few secrets that none of us suspected. The embezzlement, for instance. And I've heard rumors that she may have been involved in some rather unsavory activities beyond simple theft." "What sort of activities?" Mrs. Clement's voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Marple leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, I probably shouldn't repeat gossip, but Dr. Haydock mentioned that the police have found evidence suggesting she was blackmailing someone. Apparently she had been receiving payments from a person whose identity she was threatening to expose." The potato peeler clattered to the floor as Mrs. Clement's hands began to tremble violently. "Blackmail? But that's horrible. Who would she—" "The police haven't said, of course," Miss Marple continued, watching the other woman's face carefully. "But Inspector Slack seems quite confident that when they arrest the blackmail victim, they'll have found their real murderer. After all, someone desperate enough to pay blackmail money would certainly be desperate enough to commit murder when the payments became too burdensome. Mrs. Clement had gone very pale, and she gripped the edge of the table as if to steady herself. But what about Mrs. Ashford? Surely they can't believe she's innocent now. Oh, I think they're beginning to have doubts about that, Miss Marple said airily. Especially since the murder weapon didn't really belong to her after all. What do you mean it didn't belong to her? Well, Doctor, Haydock told me in confidence that when they examined the knitting needle more closely, they found fingerprints on it that don't match Mrs. Ashford's. In fact, the prints belonged to someone who was definitely at the meeting that night. Someone who had access to Mrs. Ashford's knitting bag and could have taken the needle without her noticing. This was, of course, complete fabrication on Miss Marple's part. But she had learned long ago that guilty people often revealed themselves when presented with false evidence that seemed to confirm their worst fears. Mrs. Clement was now visibly shaking. Fingerprints. But surely, lots of people might have touched that needle if it was lying about somewhere. That's true, Miss Marple agreed, but combined with the other evidence they found, it paints quite a clear picture. You see, Mrs. Pemberton left a message before she died. Worked into her knitting, would you believe? Rather clever of her, really. She spelled out the name of her blackmailer, presumably hoping someone would notice if anything happened to her. Mrs. Clement made a small, choked sound and pressed her hands to her mouth. Miss Marple continued relentlessly, her voice remaining gentle despite the devastating nature of her words. The thing about blackmail, Mrs. Clement, is that it never really stops. Once someone has that kind of hold over you, they keep coming back for more, and eventually the victim becomes so desperate that murder seems like the only way out. Stop, Mrs. Clement whispered. Please just stop. But Miss Marple pressed on. I imagine it started small, didn't it? Perhaps just a few pounds here and there. But Mrs. Pemberton was greedy, and she had debts of her own to pay, so the demands kept increasing, until you realized you would never be free of her. Mrs. Clement buried her face in her hands and began to weep, not the gentle tears of grief, but the harsh, desperate sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She found out, she gasped between sobs. I don't know how, but she found out about William, about my first marriage. She said she had proof, documents, photographs. She was going to tell everyone, ruin Leonard's career, destroy our life here. Miss Marple reached across the table and took the weeping woman's hands in her own. Your first husband, William Parsons, he's still alive, isn't he? Mrs. Clement nodded miserably. I thought he was dead. He went missing in France in 1936, and I waited 2 years for news. When none came, I assumed. So many men were lost in those early skirmishes. I met Leonard at a church social, and he was so kind, so different from William. When he proposed, I thought God was giving me a second chance at happiness. But William survived. He was in a military hospital, suffering from shell shock and memory loss. He didn't even remember his own name for nearly 3 years. By the time he recovered, I was already married to Leonard and living here in St. Mary Mead. I thought I was safe, that no one would ever connect Ellen Parsons with Ellen Clement. How did Mrs. Pemberton discover the truth? Mrs. Clement wiped her eyes with a shady hand. William had hired a private investigator to find me. He wanted to reconcile, to try again. The investigator tracked me down through church records and sent a letter to Mrs. Pemberton by mistake. Our addresses were similar, and he confused the house numbers. She opened it before realizing it wasn't for her, but by then she had seen enough to understand what it meant. and she demanded money to keep quiet. At first, it wasn't much. £20, she said, just to help with some expenses. But then it became 30, then 50. She said she needed the money for her own debts, that she was doing me a favor by giving me time to decide how to handle the situation. But I knew she would never shop. Miss Marple could see the whole tragic story unfolding. A woman trapped between two impossible choices, her past and her present, driven to desperate measures by greed and fear. Tell me what happened that night, Mrs. Clement, at the knitting circle meeting. Mrs. Clement's voice was barely audible. She had demanded £100. I didn't have it, of course. I had been taking small amounts from the church collection, but Leonard was starting to notice discrepancies in the accounts. I went to the meeting hoping to plead with her, to make her understand that I couldn't keep paying. But she refused to listen. She laughed at me, said that if I couldn't afford to pay, perhaps it was time for the truth to come out. She was enjoying it, Miss Marple. She was actually enjoying my terror. When I went outside for air, I thought I was going to be sick. She followed me, started talking about how she might approach Leonard directly, suggest that he might want to know about his wife's interesting past. Miss Marple could picture the scene. Two women in the gathering dusk outside the village hall, one desperate and the other coldly calculating. The knitting needle. I had noticed Mrs. Ashford's beautiful German chat earlier in the evening. When she was having trouble with her cable pattern, she had asked me to hold her needles while she unknitted a section. I slipped one into my pocket. I don't even remember deciding to do it. It was just there when I needed it. And when you came back inside, Mrs. Pemberton was sitting in her corner, working on that baby blanket. She looked up at me with such a smug expression, as if she was savoring my humiliation. I walked behind her chair, pretending to look at Miss Weatherby's knitting, and then Mrs. Clement shuddered. It was over so quickly. She barely had time to cry out. And then you went back to your own seat and continued knitting as if nothing had happened. I thought I could get away with it. Everyone knew about Mrs. Ashford's missing needle, and she was new to the village, with no real friends to defend her. It seemed like the perfect solution. Miss Marple felt a deep sadness for both women, the victim, whose greed had ultimately led to her death, and the perpetrator, whose desperation had driven her to murder. But she also felt anger at the waste of it all, the destruction of multiple lives over secrets that might have been resolved with honesty and courage. Mrs. Clement, she said gently, you must understand that you cannot let Mrs. Ashford suffer for your crime. She's innocent, and she's already endured far too much pain in her life. The vicar's wife looked up with red-rimmed eyes. I know. I've been thinking about it constantly since I arrested her. But I'm so frightened, Miss Marple. If the truth comes out, it won't just be me who suffers. Leonard will lose his position, his reputation. And William, poor William, has already lost so many years of his life. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, Miss Marple observed. Wouldn't it be better to face it honestly than to let it destroy even more lives through deception? Mrs. Clement was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hand folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been throughout their conversation. What should I do? You should speak to Inspector Slack, Miss Marple said firmly. Tell him the truth about what happened that night. It won't be easy, but it's the only way to begin making amends for what you've done. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the complexity of human nature and the tragic consequences of secrets kept too long. Mrs. Clement was not an evil woman. She was someone who had made a series of increasingly desperate choices when faced with an impossible situation. but that did not excuse murder, nor could it justify allowing an innocent woman to suffer for crimes she had not committed. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would have to ensure that Inspector Slack heard the full truth, whether Mrs. Clement found the courage to confess or not. The threads of the mystery were finally beginning to come together, but Miss Marple knew that the final pattern would bring pain to many people in St. Mary Mead. Sometimes the truth was a bitter medicine, but it was always necessary for healing to begin. Chapter 7. The Final Stitch. The village hall felt different that evening, shadows seeming to lurk in corners where cheerful lamplight had once banished all darkness. Miss Marple had requested that all the surviving members of the knitting circle gather once more in the very room where poor Mrs. Pemberton had met her end just 3 days prior. "I do hope this won't take long," said Miss Weatherby, her sharp voice betraying an unusual nervousness as she settled into her customary chair. "The whole business has been most distressing." Mrs. Bantry nodded agreement, though her usual composure seemed somewhat strained. "Indeed, Jane, I must say I'm not entirely comfortable being here again so soon." Mrs. Ashford sat quietly in the corner, her face pale and drawn from her ordeal in custody. The poor woman had aged years in the space of days, and Miss Marple's heart went out to her. Mrs. Clement bustled about, arranging chairs with her characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she worked. Inspector Slack stood near the door, his expression one of barely concealed irritation. "Miss Marple, I do hope you'll have good reason for this theatrical gathering. Mrs. Ashford has been released, yes, but only because we're still gathering evidence. The case against her remains strong." "Oh, but Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, settling into her chair and taking out her knitting. "I'm afraid the case against poor Mrs. Ashford is rather like a jumper knitted with the wrong pattern. It may look right from a distance, but when you examine it closely, you can see that the stitches don't match up properly." She began to knit as she spoke, her needles clicking rhythmically in the tense silence. "You see, I've been thinking quite a lot about patterns lately. Knitting patterns, of course, but also the patterns people weave in their lives. Sometimes we try so hard to create a perfect picture that we forget how easily one dropped stitch can unravel everything." Mrs. Clement paused in her chair arrangement. "Whatever do you mean, Miss Marple?" "Well, my dear, I mean that someone in this room has been living a lie for so long, that when that lie was threatened, murder seemed the only way to preserve the pattern they had worked so hard to create." The room felt deadly quiet, except for the soft click of Miss Marple's needles. "Mrs. Pemberton wasn't just embezzling money from our charity fund," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Oh no, that was merely what she wanted us to think. She was actually replacing the money she had borrowed, money she needed to pay someone who was bleeding her dry with demands for silence." Inspector Slack found. "Blackmail. But we found no evidence." "Because the blackmail wasn't about money, Inspector. It was about respectability, about position, about the kind of secret that could destroy not just one person, but an entire family standing in the community." Miss Marple's needles paused as she looked up at the assembled group. "You see, Mrs. Pemberton discovered that one of our little circle was not who she appeared to be. She discovered that beneath the perfect stitches of a respectable life, someone had been hiding a rather large hole." Mrs. Clement's face had grown very white. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "Don't you, my dear?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her pale blue eyes were sharp as steel needles. "Mrs. Pemberton discovered your secret, didn't she? She learned that Mrs. Dorothy Clement, the devoted vicar's wife, had once been someone else entirely. Someone who had made rather different choices during the war." The silence stretched taut as a knitting thread about to snap. "She found out that you were once Mrs. Harold Winters, weren't you? A woman who abandoned her husband and small child in Birmingham when the bombs began falling. A woman who took advantage of the chaos to disappear entirely and reinvent herself in a new place, with a new name, and eventually a new husband who knew nothing of her past." Mrs. Clemens sank slowly into the nearest chair, her hands gripping the wooden arms. "You don't understand. You can't possibly understand what it was like. The fear, the desperation." "Oh, but I think I do understand," Miss Marple said softly. "War makes us all do things we never thought possible. The question is what we do afterward, whether we try to make amends or simply pretend it never happened." "Harold was drinking," Mrs. Clement whispered, her voice barely audible. "The war, the stress. He became violent. And little Tommy, he was so frightened all the time. I thought if I just left, if I gave them a chance to start fresh without me. But instead of making things right when the war ended, you chose to become someone new entirely. You met the good vicar, fell in love, and decided that Dorothy Winters was dead and buried. Only she wasn't, was she? Because Mrs. Pemberton somehow discovered the truth." Mrs. Clemens' composure finally cracked. "She found an old photograph in my sewing basket, a picture of Tommy I couldn't bear to throw away. She recognized the child somehow. Her sister had lived in Birmingham during the war. She put the pieces together and confronted me, and began demanding money for her silence. At first, yes, small amounts. I thought I could manage it. But then she became greedier, more demanding. She wanted more than I had, and when I couldn't pay." Mrs. Clemens' voice broke entirely. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his hand moving toward his handcuffs, but Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. "Tell us about that evening, my dear. Tell us how it really happened." Mrs. Clement looked around the room at the faces of the women she had sat with, knitted with, shared confidences with. "I came early to set up the chairs as I always do. Violet was already here, working on her accounts. She told me she needed another £50 by the end of the week, or she'd tell everyone the truth about me. She said she'd tell my husband first, make sure he knew exactly what kind of woman he'd married. That must have been very frightening. Terrifying. Gerald's position, his calling. He would have been ruined. The scandal would have destroyed him. And Tommy. My son would have learned that his mother was not dead as he'd been told, but had simply abandoned him when he needed her most." Mrs. Clemens' hands twisted in her lap. I tried to reason with her, to explain that I was already giving her everything I could, but she just laughed and said that was my problem to solve. She went back to her knitting, dismissing me as if I were nothing. And then I saw Mrs. Ashford's knitting bag on the table where she left it from the week before. Those distinctive needles of hers with the silver tops. I'd always admired them. I don't even remember deciding to take one. I was standing behind Violet, and she was bent over her work, and suddenly I was pushing the needle into her neck. The room erupted in gasps and small cries of shock, but Miss Marple remained calm, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. "It happened so quickly," Mrs. Clement continued, tears streaming down her face now. "One moment she was alive and threatening me, and the next she was slumped over her knitting. I tried to make it look like robbery, scattered some things about, but then I realized the needle would point to Mrs. Ashford, and I thought if she were blamed, the investigation would stop there. But you underestimated Mrs. Pemberton's final message," Miss Marple said quietly. "That knitting pattern with its deliberate mistakes. She was trying to tell us about the blackmail, wasn't she? Even as she was dying, she was trying to ensure the truth would come out. Mrs. Clement nodded miserably. She managed to pull some stitches loose to create that pattern. I saw her doing it, but I thought she was just dying. I didn't realize she was spelling out hope and lies until you mentioned it. Inspector Slack finally moved forward, his expression grim but not unkind. Mrs. Dorothy Clement, I arrest you for the murder of Mrs. Violet Pemberton. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mrs. Clement looked back at Miss Marple with something almost like gratitude. How did you know? How did you piece it all together? Miss Marple sat down her knitting and looked at the woman with infinite compassion. Oh, my dear, it was the little things. The way you flinched when Inspector Slack mentioned checking backgrounds. The fact that you knew exactly how to stage a crime scene. Something a sheltered vicar's wife shouldn't know, but someone who lived through the chaos of wartime Birmingham might. And most of all, the pattern in your own knitting. My knitting. Yes, dear. I noticed that while everyone else's work showed their individual styles and quirks, yours was almost too perfect, like someone who had learned to knit later in life and was determined to do it exactly right. Most of us learned as children and developed our little idiosyncrasies, but you knitted like someone who had taught herself from a book, determined to leave no trace of the woman you used to be. As Mrs. Clement was led away, the remaining women sat in stunned silence. Finally, Mrs. Ashford spoke, her voice shaky but clear. She saved my life, you know. If Miss Marple hadn't discovered the truth, I would have gone to prison for something I didn't do. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, examining the even stitches. The truth has a way of working itself to the surface, my dear, like a mistake in a pattern. You can try to hide it, but eventually it will show. The only question is whether we're brave enough to acknowledge it and try to repair the damage, or whether we let fear make us do terrible things to keep it hidden. She looked around at the remaining members of their little circle, her expression gentle but firm. I think we've all learned something about the patterns we weave in our lives, haven't we? And perhaps about the importance of a little kindness and understanding for those whose stitches haven't always been as neat as we might like. Chapter 8. Binding off. The autumn sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary Mead's parish church, casting jeweled patterns across the worn stone floor. It had been 3 weeks since the arrest of Mrs. Dorothy Clement, and the village was slowly beginning to heal from the shock that had shaken its very foundations. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her knitting bag beside her as always. The service had ended, and most of the congregation had filed out, but she remained, watching as the new interim vicar, young Mr. Henderson from Marchbenham, extinguished the altar candles with careful reverence. Poor Gerald Clement had suffered a complete breakdown upon learning the truth about his wife's past and present crimes. He had been sent to a rest home in Bournemouth, where doctors hoped the sea air and quiet might restore his shattered nerves. The parish council had acted swiftly to ensure the spiritual needs of Saint Mary Mead continued to be met, though everyone agreed it would take time to find a permanent replacement. Miss Marple. She turned to find Mrs. Ashford approaching hesitantly, her face still bearing traces of the ordeal she had endured. The woman had aged visibly in the past month, but there was something different about her now, the strength that hadn't been there before. My dear Mrs. Ashford, how are you managing? Better, I think. Mrs. Ashford settled into the pew beside her. Inspector Slack came by yesterday with the final paperwork. All charges officially dropped, he said, though I don't think he was entirely pleased about being wrong. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. Inspector Slack is a good man at heart, but he does prefer his cases to be straightforward. I'm afraid this one was rather more complicated than he likes. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sound of Mr. Henderson's footsteps echoing in the chancel as he went about his duties. Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashford said quietly, I wanted to thank you properly. Not just for clearing my name, but for seeing me as a person rather than just a suspect. For something approaching genuine healing. The Lavender Fields Tea Garden had been purchased by a cooperative of legitimate aromatherapists and herbalists, led by Sarah Mills, who had proven herself both knowledgeable and ethically grounded in her approach to natural remedies. The new owners had retained the essential beauty of the setting, while completely restructuring the philosophy that governed its operations. We're very careful about the claims we make, Sarah explained as she showed Miss Marple around the renovated facilities. Everything we do is designed to complement conventional medical treatment, never to replace it. We make it absolutely clear that our services are for relaxation and general well-being only. The transformation was evident in every detail, from the prominently displayed disclaimers about the limitations of herbal treatments to the requirement that all clients with serious medical conditions provide letters from their physicians before receiving any services. The new management had created exactly the sort of ethical operation that Mrs. Thornfield had pretended to run. The herb cottage had been converted into an educational centre where visitors could learn about the genuine history and properties of medicinal plants. Mrs. Weatherby had donated her grandmother's recipes and preparations to the project, ensuring that authentic traditional knowledge would be preserved and properly attributed for future generations. It's what Emma would have wanted, Mrs. Weatherby told Miss Marple during the opening ceremony. She always believed that healing knowledge belonged to the community, not to individuals seeking personal profit. Dr. Haydock's trial had concluded the previous month with a verdict that reflected the community's complex feelings about his crime. The jury had found him guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, accepting the defense argument that his actions had been the result of extreme emotional disturbance, caused by his inability to protect the innocent people through legal means. The judge's sentencing had been notably lenient, reflecting both Dr. Haydock's previously exemplary character and the extraordinary circumstances that had driven him to commit his crime. He had received a suspended sentence contingent upon his agreement to undergo psychological counseling and to surrender his medical license permanently. The court recognizes that Dr. Haydock's actions, while legally inexcusable, were motivated by a genuine desire to protect vulnerable people from a dangerous predator, the judge had observed in his remarks. The failure of regulatory systems to address Mrs. Thornfield's activities does not justify taking the law into one's own hands, but it does provide important context for understanding why a man of previously unblemished character felt driven to such extreme measures. The community had rallied around Dr. Haydock throughout his ordeal, with dozens of former patients providing character references and financial support for his legal defense. Many villagers privately expressed the view that he had performed a public service, even while acknowledging that his methods had been wrong. Mrs. Fletcher had used the notoriety surrounding the case to rebuild her business on a foundation of complete honesty about her products and methods. She had voluntarily submitted to rigorous organic certification procedures and had become an advocate for stronger regulation of alternative health claims. I learned that cutting corners and compromising principles ultimately destroys everything you're trying to build, she reflected during one of her conversations with Miss Marple. Mrs. Thornfield's corruption infected everyone who dealt with her, and we all bear some responsibility for enabling her activities. The broader impact of the case had extended far beyond St. Mary Mead. Prompting regulatory reform is designed to prevent future Mrs. Thornfields from exploiting vulnerable people with fraudulent medical claims. New legislation had been introduced to close the jurisdictional gaps that had allowed her to operate with impunity for so long. Inspector Slack had been promoted to Chief Inspector, partly in recognition of his thorough investigation of the case. though he continued to express frustration about the systemic failures that had made Dr. Haydock's crimes unnecessary. The police response to similar cases had been significantly strengthened, with specialized units trained to investigate medical fraud. We can't prevent every charlatan from making false claims, Inspector Slag admitted to Miss Marple, but we can certainly respond more quickly and effectively when people like Mrs. Thornfield start endangering lives. Most poignant aspect of the case's resolution had been the establishment of a memorial fund in Jennifer Morrison's name, designed to provide support for families affected by medical fraud. Dr. Haydock had contributed his life savings to the fund. It had grown substantially through donations from community members who recognized the tragedy that had sparked the entire affair. Mrs. Morrison's children had been among the beneficiaries of the fund, receiving educational scholarships that would ensure their futures, despite the loss of their mother to Mrs. Thornfield's deceptions. The irony that their mother's death had ultimately led to protections for other potential victims provided some measure of meaning to their tragedy. Miss Marple had maintained a correspondence with Dr. Haydock throughout his trial and the months that followed, offering support and friendship to a man who had lost everything in his determination to protect others. His letters revealed a complex mixture of remorse and satisfaction that spoke to the moral ambiguity at the heart of the case. "I cannot claim that I regret Mrs. Thornfield's death," he had written in one particularly candid letter. "Her activities were ended before she could expand them nationally, and I have no doubt that my actions saved lives. Yet I am haunted by the knowledge that I violated the most fundamental principles of my profession and faith." The doctor had found some peace in his counseling sessions, coming to terms with the psychological pressures that had driven him to murder, while accepting responsibility for his choices. His counselor had suggested that his crime had been the result of a form of moral injury, a psychological condition affecting people who witness preventable suffering, that they are powerless to stop through legitimate means. As Miss Marple walked through the restored lavender fields in the gathering twilight, she reflected on the complex lessons of the case. Mrs. Thornfield's exploitation of desperate people had created the conditions for her own destruction, but her death had also revealed the inadequacy of legal protections for vulnerable consumers of alternative medicine. The purple blooms swayed gently in the evening breeze, their fragrance carrying memories of deception and tragedy, but also hope for renewal and redemption. The new management had preserved the beauty of the setting while transforming its purpose from exploitation to genuine service. The fairy lights that had once illuminated Mrs. Thornfield's theatrical performances now provided gentle illumination for educational workshops and legitimate therapeutic sessions. The preparation tables that had once held fraudulent remedies now displayed honestly labeled products with clear explanations of their limited benefits. Sarah Mill's approach to Miss Marple completed her trek to the garden, carrying a steaming cup of herbal tea that bore no resemblance to Mrs. Thornfield's dangerous concoctions. The young woman had matured considerably during the months since the murder, gaining both knowledge and wisdom from her involvement in creating something positive from the tragedy. "We received another inquiry today from someone wanting to establish a similar operation in Yorkshire," Sarah reported. "The demand for ethical alternative therapy seems to be growing, as people learn about the differences between legitimate practice and the sort of fraud Mrs. Thornfield represented." Miss Marple accepted the tea gratefully, noting that its simple lavender fragrance carried none of the overwhelming intensity that Mrs. Thornfield had used to mask her deceptions. The new approach emphasized subtlety and honesty over theatrical effects and exaggerated claims. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky, "that this place has finally found its proper purpose. Mrs. Thornfield corrupted something beautiful and turned it into an instrument of exploitation. Now it serves the healing mission she pretended to embrace." The evening mist began to settle over the fields as Miss Marple prepared to return to the village, carrying with her the satisfaction of knowing that something positive had emerged from the tragedy. The case had ended with a murder and a destroyed life, but it had also led to protections for vulnerable people, and a genuine understanding of the importance of a ethical practice in alternative medicine. As she walked away from the lavender fields, Miss Marple reflected that justice had indeed bloomed purple in this place, not through the conventional workings of law and order, but through the complex interplay of human conscience, community response, and the ultimate triumph of integrity over deception. The fragrance of healing had finally replaced the scent of fraud, and the evening breeze carried with it the promise of genuine renewal.